Good afternoon, class, and welcome to the second part of the lecture covering Chapter 10, Carl Rogers and his Self-Actualization Theory. So, let's get started. So, let's just kind of go back a little bit to where we were, just a brief overview. So, okay, so last class we left off speaking about the development of the self in childhood. We spoke about how infants develop a need for positive regard that guides behavior. That positive regard is acceptance, love, and approval from others. That positive regard is a universal need in that all of us experience this need and that it's persistent within our lives. We also spoke about unconditional positive regard and positive self-regard. So unconditional positive regard is approval granted regardless of a person's behavior, which you can equate to unconditional love. And then positive self-regard, the condition under which an individual grants him or herself acceptance and approval. We'd also added that the self-concept is who we are, who we should be, and who we'd like to be. And ideally, it is a consistent pattern and an organized whole. Positive regard is crucial to personality development. If infants don't receive positive regard, they will feel that their self has been rejected. They will then behave in a way that provides them with positive regard, but won't be consistent with their self-concept. And without positive regard, the tendency towards actualization and development is hampered. Okay, so let's move along. We also covered the need for positive regard is reciprocal in nature, in that by satisfying somebody else's need for positive regard, you yourself experience a satisfaction of that need. It feels good to make somebody else feel good. Due to importance of positive regard, we become sensitive to attitudes and behaviors of other people. Why? Our sensitivity to the attitudes and behaviors of other people will allow us or better position us to be able to elicit positive regard from our environment. Positive self-regard is a condition under which we grant ourselves acceptance as approval, as spoke about last slide, just to add. In forming our self-concept, we internalize the attitudes of others, and that positive self-regard becomes our main source of positive regard and is related to positive mental health. Then we looked at conditions of worth. So conditions of worth being belief that a person is worthy of approval when they, one, express desirable behaviors and refrains from behavior that brings disapproval. So again, conditions of worth is belief that a person is worthy of approval when they express desirable behaviors and refrain from behavior that brings disapproval. Conditional positive regard is approval, love, and acceptance only for desirable behaviors and attitudes. The opposite of unconditional positive regard, which is receiving that approval or love, no matter how you behave. And infants learn this very quickly, that not all of our actions or behaviors are going to lead to positive regard, and that there's a price there's a price for our parents' affection. So the conditions of worth are similar to the Freudian concept of the superego, in that it involves an idea or concept of how we should be behaving and is based on the standards that are usually put in by our external environment. So in childhood, usually our parents or our primary caregiver. External standards of judgment become internal and personal. Children develop self-regard only in situations that brought parental approval. They develop conditions of worth based on parental standards. So what I wanted to add to that is, if a child, and this is important, if a child receives unconditional positive regard from the parents, they do not develop conditions of worth. Please take a note of that. Okay, let's move along. So Continuing along, development of the self in childhood. So incongruence. Incongruence is a discrepancy or difference between one's self-concept and aspects of experience. So we mentioned before that ideally one's self-concept is a consistent pattern and organized whole. Incongruence speaks to the discrepancy between one's self-concept and aspects of experience. Experiences incongruent to one's self-concept become threatening and cause anxiety. So an example with that is if you have a self-concept where you believe that you see yourself as someone to be really kind and loving of all people, if you then meet somebody who creates feelings of hate, so if you then meet somebody who you have feelings of hate towards, that is an experience that is inconsistent with your self-concept, and experiencing that experience or the feelings of hate become threatening and can lead to anxiety. Furthermore, a level of psychological adjustment is a degree of congruence between one's self-concept and experiences. The more similarity or congruence between our self-concept and our experiences, the more psychologically adjusted or psychologically healthy that we are. So to add some points from that from underneath the slide, individuals will deny or distort experiences that are incongruent with their self-concept. Again, very important. Individuals will deny or distort experiences that are incongruent with their self-concept. We learn to evaluate, accept, or reject experiences in terms of if they bring positive regard, not if they help us with actualization tendency. Again, we learn to evaluate, accept, or reject experiences in terms of if they bring us positive regard, not if they help us towards the actualization tendency. Moreover, psychologically healthy people see things as they are. They are open to new experiences because nothing threatens their concept of self. This happens when you receive unconditional positive regard, meaning you don't have to internalize conditions of worth. This is extremely important, so I'm going to repeat. Psychologically healthy people see things as they are. They don't need to deny or distort certain experiences. Why? Because they're open to new experiences, because nothing threatens their concept of self. So if nothing threatens their self-concept, it means that they don't experience anxiety and there is no need to distort or deny certain experiences. And meaning that you don't have to internalize conditions of worth. Okay, let's move along. So the fully functioning person. With the fully functioning person involves the process of self-actualization, involves developing all facets of the self, and a desired result of psychological development. So what does that mean? When a person experiences congruence between their experiences and their self-concept, they can develop and actualize all facets of self, leads to becoming fully functioning. They don't have to deny or distort any experiences or facets of self. They can develop and actualize all facets. What's also important to note is that it's not this self-actualized person, it's self-actualization. What that means is that self-actualization is a never-ending and ongoing process. It's like perfection. It's not something that you reach, it's something that you continually strive towards. Also very important to understand. According to Rogers, to be fully functioning leads to what he referred as the good life. I do want you to remember that. To be fully functioning leads to, which is the ultimate goal, leads to what he referred to as the good life. Okay. So table 10.1, which yes, is in your textbook, covers the characteristics of fully functioning persons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characteristics. So you can find this in your book. What I've done at the bottom of the slide is I've added some points for each one of these characteristics. So I've labeled them 1 through 6, and for each one I've just written a little point. So for the first one, awareness of all experience and open to positive as well as negative feelings, I added that no distortions or denial of experiences, as nothing can threaten the self-concept. For the second characteristic, which is freshness of appreciation for all experiences, I added experiences are not predicted or anticipated. They are participated in fully rather than observed. They don't, right? You don't need to anticipate or predict certain experiences because you don't need that sense of safety and comfort that comes with knowing what's going to come. You're open to engaging with new experiences because, again, you don't feel that anything's going to threaten your self-concept. Third characteristic, trust in one's own behavior and feelings. I added, you trust your own reactions instead of being guided by the opinions of others or their intellectual judgments or social codes. All info or data can be used about experiences. Number 4, so for freedom of choice without inhibitions, I added belief that their future depends on their own actions. For number 5, creativity and spontaneity, I added seek new experiences and challenges. Don't need predictability, security, or freedom for comfort, as similar to what you mentioned before. And then finally, for the last characteristic, continual need to grow, to strive to maximize one's potential in a state of actualizing. I added self-development or self-actualization is a continuous process. And then at the bottom of that slide, what I also added was being fully functioning is not an easy task. It is inherent with challenges and having to test yourself. The other thing to note is being fully functioning does not equate to or is not synonymous with being happy. Also very important to keep in mind. Okay, let's move along. So, questions about human nature. So, there was in Rogers' theory, there was an emphasis on free will rather than things being determined. So again, remember, what he felt is that um, the client themselves had the resources and had the natural drive towards actualization, the ability to create their own change. We're just a facilitator. It is not a deterministic theory in that it doesn't feel that everything is predetermined by certain instincts or drives or our experiences with the first 5 years of life or throughout childhood. There's more focus on nurture influence. So in the battle of nature, the things that we're born or innate or are innate versus nurture, the influence of our environment and experiences, as you can tell, Rogers focused on the client's own experience of their reality. So clearly there was more of a focus on nurture, but at the same time, there is a part of it that in terms of nature, and then he felt that we were all born with this drive or motivation towards actualization. So the actualization tendency. It was more inclined towards our present experience rather than focusing on the past. Recognize uniqueness and universality. So the universality is that everybody experiences the actualization tendency. Also, there's a universal need for positive regard. What is unique is how people interpret and respond to their subjective realities. And then speaking with the characteristics that you saw from the last slide, and so if we jump back, the characteristics of a fully functioning person, what is also unique is while those characteristics are universal, the way that individuals express them is unique and has variation. The growth process, right? It's the importance of growth over life. And it is optimistic as he felt, as I mentioned before, everybody has the tools and the resources to create the changes and improvements that they need in their own personality, whereas the therapist is solely there to act as a facilitator or to assist in that process. Very important you understand this slide. Okay. So, assessments in Rogers' theory. There was, sorry, just a moment. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's look a little bit at assessment in Rogers' theory. So we have person-centered therapy, we have encounter groups, and we have psychological tests. So person-centered therapy. Client is assumed to be responsible for changing his or her personality. The focus is on subjective conscious experiences, and the client is given unconditional positive regard by therapists. So as you can see here, person-centered therapy, what's also important is not just it's centered on the other person and their subjective experience. There's also a lot of importance involved in the relationship between the client and the therapist. So if you contrast this to the Freudian approach, where the therapist was really both sometimes physically and emotionally distant, kept out of sight, didn't want to influence in any way. Here it's really different. The importance is that the therapeutic relationship must have a climate or an environment of warmth and trust and safety and unconditional positive regard, as you say there, giving that client the freedom and the comfort to then feel that they can, remember, unconditional positive regard, when we receive that, we no longer need conditions of worth, as we mentioned before. So in therapy, the way this plays out is that if the therapist provides their client with unconditional positive regard, right, the positive feedback that you get isn't dependent on a certain way of behaving, that person is now able to be, right, they're able to behave in a way that is more freeing, in that they're not worried about how the therapist is going to react towards them because they have unconditional positive regard. This helps the therapist because the client isn't behaving in a way that is only focused on the positive regard. They're behaving in a way that is consistent with their self-concept. That is healthy for the client. That is helpful for the therapist, in that it gives them a true window into what that person's subjective reality is in its totality, along with their self-concept. Okay. Encounter groups. Group is a group therapy technique. So people learn about their feelings and how they relate to one another. Facilitators help members to gain insight, right? And that self-insight we spoke about at the beginning of the chapter, and how important it is in terms of determining behavior. And again, the reason why the encounter groups help is that in that group therapy environment, right, it says people learn about their feelings and how they relate to one another. By everybody learning that and sharing, it makes it a safe environment. And then people are able to incorporate all aspects of their experience of the reality, but also to learn from other people and their other viewpoints. That's how it helps them gain insight. Now, and for psychological tests, the experience inventory and the experiencing scale, what I want you to keep note of here is that Rogers himself did not use or develop any psychological tests. I repeat, he did not use or develop any psychological tests. However, because of the popularity and influence of his theory, a significant amount of tests were and scales were developed based on his theory. Important to keep in mind. Okay. So if we move along, So, research on Rogers' theory. So, focus, client self-report. Introduce recording and filming of therapy sessions. Person-centered therapy. And what came from that in the research was the QSOR technique, a self-report technique used to assess someone's self-concept. Research on Rogers' theory also led to also explored and supported the openness to experience, importance of the acceptance of self, and emotional adjustment. So talks a little bit about research on some of Rogers' ideas. So research on Rogers' approach has found that positive self-regard may be more important in individualistic cultures. So just really briefly, there are individualistic and collectivist cultures. Here in North America, we would be seen as individualistic culture, whereas the emphasis and the importance is placed on the individual and individual well-being. Whereas in collectivist cultures, it's more about unit. So whether that could be the family unit as a whole, and you see in certain cultures the importance of kids staying home longer, the importance and the obligation at times, or responsibility for kids to always take care of their parents, which is also be very different in North America. So in individualistic cultures, positive self-regard may be more important. Research has also showed that fully functioning persons are open to all experiences. Furthermore, it's shown that a child's self-acceptance depends in part on the mother's degree of self-acceptance of herself. Children whose parents accept them unconditionally have high self-esteem. Those who possess incongruence between perceived self and ideal self are poorly adjusted emotionally and have low self-esteem and self-actualization. And then finally, research showed that failing to realize our innate potential can lead to maladjustment. Important for you guys to know. Okay, so let's move along. Criticisms on Rogers' theory. Criticism is that, as I mentioned before, it mainly disregarded the unconscious factors that could influence behavior. So what I want to add to that is when Rogers was doing his own when Rogers was doing his work, he mainly relied on client self-reports. One of the criticisms was that in him doing so, by solely relying on client self-reports, again, he did this because he felt the most important thing was understanding the client's subjective reality. What the criticism of his theory, it felt that by him doing that, it didn't account for important factors that the clients were unaware of and therefore couldn't make note of in their self-report, but those factors still having an influence on that client's personality. So that was a shortcoming or a criticism of his theory. And also that subjective reports may be distorted, right? So the validity or the reliability of using subjective reports. Some of his contributions is that his theory was used widely to help veterans adjust to civilian life after World War II. And that person-centered therapy became popular and highly accessible, and is very much used today. I can tell you that. Reflections on Rogers' theory. So, core concepts are accepted across different orientations in therapeutic work with clients. Self-actualization, concept of self, etc. His theory is influential in counseling and psychotherapy, which I can attest to, that a lot of what I do right now in my current practice uses a lot of these concepts in this approach. And the emphasis on self-concept is widely recognized. So, as I mentioned, this concludes the second part or second half of chapter 10 on Carl Rogers's self-actualization theory. What I will be doing is, so I know that on the course outline it said that after this set of slides it would be the end. So this week would be the end of class. We've been given the possibility of extending class for another week. So what I'm going to do is this. I am not going to assign you guys more work, but I am going to put up more lecture slides covering different chapters. So that way you don't have any work to do, but I think it's for your own reading and learning. I think it would be really important and helpful for you, whether it's moving forward in this program of psychology, or if you're going on to university, or if you want to work in the field. I think it'd be really beneficial. So again, it's there for you to read, whether you want to read it in this month or in a year from now, it's there for you. Thank you for your time. Stay healthy, stay safe. Take care.